Aloha. Welcome to the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies Transnational Crime Series Take20. My name is Lieutenant Commander Keith Wilkins, U.S. Coast Guard Military Fellow at DKI APCSS. Thank you for joining us. I also want to thank Dr. Beth Kuntz, DKI APCSS, and Ms. Gina Fiore from the Pew Charitable Trust in making this webinar possible. Today's topic is understanding transshipment and crime, the Outlaw Ocean Project, and the Carrier Vessel Portal. DKI APCSS has a non-attribution policy. Speakers should not be quoted by name or country without their express permission. We are honored to have 3 exceptional speakers. I will introduce each before their presentation. Our first speaker is Mr. Ian Urbina. He is a reporter and author who writes for the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and others. Ian is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Outlaw Ocean, in 2019. Based on 5 years of reporting, much of it offshore exploring lawlessness on the high seas. Ian has since launched the Outlaw Ocean nonprofit, which engaged in innovative storytelling practices on ocean issues, including the Outlaw Ocean Music Project. Ian, the virtual floor is yours.
So I'm just going to talk for about 20 minutes about what we do at the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is the name of the nonprofit. It's a journalistic nonprofit. And then maybe, if time permits, focus on a couple of stories that might segue nicely, quite especially to Global Fishing Watch, the subsequent panelist. So I'm a journalist, and about 7 years ago now, 2014, 6 years ago, began a series at the New York Times about lawlessness offshore. The goal of this reporting was several. One, methodologically, we wanted to tell these stories in long-form narrative investigative fashion, in ideally very evocative, kind of high polish way that gave readers the sense of being there in the space. And to do that meant we needed to get out in the space and really chronicle these stories at sea. Number two, we wanted to sort of broaden what people understand is happening out there. When you mention maritime crime to an average person, they might think of often Hollywood-induced, the BP spill or Somali piracy or plastic pollution, all very important issues, but their spectrum of understanding was narrow. And the goal of the reporting was to show that there's a lot more happening out there, and just sort of establish diversity of human rights, labor, and environmental abuses that are quite intertwined. And as Mario from Interpol quite rightly pointed out, all of these various types of crimes, be they human rights, labor, and environment, sort of sit on a foundation of document fraud, tax evasion, corruption, bribery, all sorts of sort of white collar paper crimes that are really consequential, fish laundering, etc. So that was one of the goals of the reporting, was to sort of broaden that spectrum. And I'll talk for a second about what that meant in practice in terms of the kinds of crimes we reported on. Lastly, we wanted to sort of tackle this space, the 2/3 of the planet that's water, as if it were a frontier, which indeed I think it is. And to think of it, to help people think of it, and sort of stoke their sense of urgency and concern about the space, by really getting people to realize that the oceans are, on the one hand, sort of the lungs of the planet, producing 50% of the oxygen we breathe, the circulatory system of our global economic system, 90% of the products we consume traverse it. And in some ways, the heart of the beast that, the kind of the living organism that is the Earth, the heart in the sense that there's work being produced out there. 56 million people work offshore, and this is a robust workplace. And yet you rarely hear from seafarers, merchant mariners, fishers. Let me just say, on the screen, what you're seeing is a collage of footage from the last 6-7 years of reporting, and in no particular order, but it just sort of gives you something to look at other than me, and gives you a sense of where we went and the reporting we did. So the kind of the last way to, I think, metaphorically think of this realm if we're going to push the biological metaphor far, is as the stomach, in the sense that, in some places in the world, over 50% of the protein that's consumed by local populations comes from these waters. So in all these ways, this realm is vast and bustling and important, and harm done there to the people, the fishers, or to the marine life, the fish, it is really of concern, should be of everyone, even those that live far away. Now, to the diversity point, I really thought it was important, and to this day, I still continue to think it's important, that it's really key to make sure we don't allow our perception of crime out there to be too narrow. So a key part of what we try to do in the reporting is talk about that diversity. So what I have in mind is the problem of sea slavery, debt bonded, captive, often migrant, often undocumented workers on these ships, and why that is distinct and acute in this space. Murder of stowaways and other abuses of stowaways, quite especially after the 9/11, why that is the case, and what sort of structural incentives exist there. Illegal whaling, obviously IUU, illegal, underreported, and unregulated fishing is a key part. Thievery at sea of various sorts, bunker fuel stealing, ship stealing, sometimes by bandits, sometimes by something else you might call repo men of the sea. These are individuals who are hired by banks and mortgage lenders to go snag ships and relocate them unilaterally. Arms trafficking, human trafficking, all of these things exist at sea. And it's really key that we think about them under a broad umbrella of a sort of dire lack of governance. Now, why there's a lack of governance, why there's a lack of enforcement, what to be done about these problems. I think some of the subsequent, Pew and Global Fishing Watch are really adept at tackling those issues, and sort of hopeful tools that exist and already accomplishments. Mario's interview speaks to some of the accomplishments from a law enforcement point of view. But our job is to keep a spotlight on the problems that exist there, and sort of render them in an explanatory way so that people don't forget about it. It's not an out of sight, out of mind realm. One of the things we do that is unusual, or sort of new and unusual, I dare say, is, at 17 years I was on staff at the New York Times, and couldn't have been happier. It's a great employer, but it is a legacy, kind of large traditional journalistic outlet. And one of the flaws that I think exists within journalism generally is that there's a lot of innovation in storytelling and reporting tactics and narrative structure. There's not as much innovation in distribution of journalism. So, and I think that matters, because if we are going to, as journalists, drive change, sort of help get taxpayers and consumers and companies and law enforcement and governments in general to really reckon with these problems, we need to bring the content out to them and not always try to court them to our platforms. So one of the things that we've been trying to do, I have a team of about 4 or 5 people that work with me, is when we produce these stories, we place them, in tier 1 venues. We have a piece coming out in 2 weeks in the New Yorker, had a piece last month in front page of the Washington Post and BBC and Der Spiegel. But we also then don't just walk away at that point. We then try to take the reporting and convert it into other forms: podcasts, Netflix series, music project, which I'll talk about in a second, infographics, which Pew does better than quite anyone on the planet. Lots of different other ways to give the reporting more life, and also to access audiences that might not come to the New York Times website or the New Yorker website, but are worth reaching out to. And those include, and here I'll focus on the music project, younger audience and more global audience. So the Outlaw Ocean Music Project is this weird experiment that we attempted, in which we thought, if I'm going to access my 17-year-old son, who consumes a lot of information but refuses to read, much to my annoyance, the New York Times, and yet he gets a fair amount of news from TikTok and Instagram Spotify and comedy and YouTube. And he's a fairly typical 17-year-old. How can we get that demographic, be they in Caracas or Taipei or New York, to increase their fluency about these issues? And so the thought here was, well, a lot of them listen to music. There's huge consumption of content on places like Spotify and Pandora. And what if we found a clever way to get our content onto those platforms, sort of commandeer these alternate cultural platforms and turn them into journalistic venues? And so that began with recruiting musicians who would take sounds from the recording of the reporting, so machine gun fire in Somalia, or chanting Cambodian deckhands on the South China Sea, or just various interesting textured sounds that we had built into a database. And then we would recruit these musicians to make an album about the reporting, choose things from the reporting that most spoke to them. Maybe it's plastic pollution, maybe it's illegal fishing, maybe it's murder at sea caught on camera, what have you. Make an album, and then we would pair that album with footage and written, kind of informational material, and then we would funnel our journalism on the backs of that music to these other platforms. And that would be one way that we would begin tapping these younger demographics and a more global audience. And the music project now has 465 musicians from 80 countries and collective listenership of 90 million, electronic, classical, ambient, all sorts of different styles. It's working, oddly. I mean, surprisingly enough to myself, in the traffic that you watch on IP that travels from these platforms over to the written stories is really striking, and you can see how long they sit on specific stories. And so it's really been fun and inspiring. And the other kind of component of the music project that is distinct is, a typical story like the one coming out in the New Yorker coming in a month or so about fish meal, costs over $100,000 to produce. We went offshore on an embed patrolling West African coast. Really expensive journalism to produce. And I had the luxury at the Times of having, a pretty well endowed employer who could afford that. But now that I'm running a nonprofit, we have to find other ways to fund this work. And the music project is, from an entrepreneurial perspective, an alternate way to do it, in the sense that the musicians provide, any money made from streaming revenue, 50% of it goes back to the musicians, and 50% of it goes to the nonprofit to fund more stories. None of it's profit that we pull, but all of it that we make goes back to the nonprofit to produce more stories. So this is another way in which we can use culture and alternate sort of stakeholders in society who care about these things, bringing their talent, donating it essentially to us, and allowing us to sort of subsidize the cost of these stories. Now, let's talk about the stories. There are a couple that I'm proud of that came out in the last 9 months. Well, one of them was this collaboration with Global Fishing Watch, who we'll turn to next. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Good. This was a story that Global Fishing Watch actually brought to me. They had done a lot of amazing work already in trying to pin down what was known generally in the East Sea and the Yellow Sea, as by fishermen, which was that there's a large presence of Chinese vessels that were routinely crossing South Korean, Japanese waters and entering North Korean waters to fish. This was a striking point because in 2017, in response to the nuclear testing, the UN Security Council unanimously signed sanctions that banned a bunch of things, including foreign fishing in North Korean waters. China was a signatory of those sanctions. And yet here, there was local knowledge that large numbers of Chinese vessels were actually fishing still in those North Korean waters. This was very important, A, because we'd seen this precipitous decline over the last decade to the tune of about 80% of the squid stock, on the one hand. And number two, we had this worrying pattern of North Korean fishermen washing up dead on Japanese shores, and no one was really sure why these numbers were increasing and why so many of these boats were getting stranded or whatever was happening, but they were dying. And so the presence of this industrial fleet was one potential contributing factor that Global Fishing Watch and a team of academics wanted to look at. They did what Global Fishing Watch does so well, which is really use smart combination of technologies, satellite technologies, quite especially, to put dots on the map and really sort of put some numbers to how many Chinese ships were actually coming into North Korean waters. These are squid vessels, and the numbers were shocking. Some have said this is the largest illegal fishing fleet ever discovered. We're looking at 700 to 900 vessels a year were coming in and fishing in those waters, all Chinese. So what we wanted to do when we were brought in as partners was to ground truth the data, essentially, and also kind of tell a story that we thought would be important to transform this from an article or a academic journal piece to something that average readers could relate to and care about and understand a little bit better. And so our goal was to go out to North Korea, to the border of North Korean waters, to park in the area where these vessels were routinely crossing, and to document that they were indeed, entering these illegal waters. And that's just what we did. We bought our way onto a squid vessel in South Korea, went to the coordinates with help from Gold Fishing Watch, and documented these ships until these Chinese ships, a small group of them, about 8 to 10, until they became aggressive and made very clear that they didn't want us filming them any further, and we peeled off. This is a perfect example of a story that I think has to be told and isn't being told by traditional venues. It's expensive. It takes a long time to do. It can be really from an editor's perspective, it can, done wrong, not pay off the cost. Done dryly, I think editors will regret having dumped $100,000, $50,000 on a story like this. And so for all these reasons, you don't see this kind of reporting routinely in tier 1 venues. This was sort of the void that we hoped at the Outlaw Ocean Project to fill. That piece ran with NBC News, and we translated into 10 languages and ran it in a bunch of other venues, Der Spiegel, BBC, Le Monde Diplomatique, so all over the world. But that's like the textbook success story for the Outlaw Ocean Project. Collaboration with academics, collaboration with NGOs, use of technology, a bit of a good news story, but also highlighting human rights concerns, i.e. the dead bodies washing up were largely washing up because of the presence of all these industrial ships that were forcing North Korean fishermen to go out further to sea and getting stranded there. And sort of an overall highlighting of the worrisome lack of governance, the lack of enforcement of laws that are already in the book, kind of scratched various itches for us. I'll talk briefly, I have 4 minutes till 20 past, about another story. This is the piece that's coming up soon in the New Yorker. This is a piece that looks at fish meal and looks at the sort of worrisome unintended consequences of the global aquaculture push. Aquaculture fish farms, either near shore or on land, at its origin, aquaculture was hoped to be a method for slowing ocean depletion, for slowing down the amount of wild-caught fish that were being pulled from the ocean. The problem that has emerged, one of many, pollution is a problem, use of antibiotics is a problem with aquaculture, but one of the problems that's emerged with aquaculture is feeding these farmed fish. And the solution previously was soy, but the price point of soy shifted, and now, and for several years now, it has been largely fish meal. And fish meal is wild-caught, ocean-caught fish, usually fish that's too small or doesn't taste good or is just hard to process, but massive amounts of this forage fish that are netted, ground up, pelletized into these high-protein powder or pellets, and then they're fed to shrimp and salmon and tuna and whatever is your penned fish. And those fish are what get sold to the EU and the US and China. And the result of fish meal is that you have an acceleration of ocean depletion being caused by the very thing that was supposed to slow ocean depletion. So we took a look at this problem and this concern as it was playing out on the coast of West Africa, along in bed on some vessels near Gambia, and sort of looked at the complicated way that both illegal and legal overfishing were not only depleting the oceans, but also contributing to local political destabilization within Gambia, in the form of corruption, in the form of bribes paid to the Chinese fish meal factories, in the form of government repression of the environmental activists who are protesting some of the pollution concerns. So this was another example of a piece that sort of has all these various things that Mario smartly was discussing, the sort of drier and banal illegalities, document fraud, corruption, as well as the more dramatic ones, human slavery, wage theft, illegal fishing, all intertwined into these worrisome dynamics that add up to IUU and other crimes. So that's in a nutshell what we do at the Outlaw Ocean Project and the kinds of stories we chase. So I'll hand it over to the next panelist from there.
Our next speaker is Mr. Tim White. He's a fisheries scientist at Global Fishing Watch who works with governments, academic partners, and nonprofits to support fisheries management and conservation. He has tracked fishing vessels, reef sharks, white sharks, and other vulnerable species to inform their management. Before joining Global Fishing Watch, Tim earned a PhD at Stanford and worked as a fisheries observer aboard Bering Sea crab boats, a research diver at the University of Alaska and the National Park Service, and a fisheries research in the US and Kiribati. Tim, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me and for letting me share this carrier vessel portal with y'all today. And thanks very much, Ian, for the kind words about your excellent work so far. As mentioned, I'm Tim White. I'm a fisheries scientist for Global Fishing Watch. Global Fishing Watch is an international nonprofit that uses satellite technology and machine learning techniques to track and visualize global fishing activity. By creating free public maps and tools to analyze fishing, we hope to support scientific research and support fisheries management efforts throughout the world. One of those tools is the carrier vessel portal, which we have partnered with the Pew Charitable Trust to develop, and that's what I'll be sharing with you today. The carrier vessel portal focuses on potential transshipment related activity. And as many of you will know, transshipment is the moving of catch from one vessel to another, often from a fishing vessel to a refrigerated transport vessel. Global Fishing Watch recognizes that transshipment at sea is a vital, often economically efficient activity for many fisheries around the world, so we wish to help support the monitoring and management of those transshipments through tools such as this. Many transshipments happen at sea, far from port controls, so in some fisheries, it could be a challenge to understand where and exactly when transshipments occur and which ones may have been authorized by respective bodies such as RFMOs or national governments. In some cases, this opens the door for IUU-related activity to occur, such as unauthorized transshipments or the underreporting of catch. So this tool is designed to help monitor where we can see potential transshipments occur to make it easier for those countries to figure out which ones may or may not have been authorized, in addition to lots of other uses. This portal is totally meant to complement all the great existing tools that are currently used for fisheries management, such as fisheries observers and VMS data sets. This on the left, I always have to mention that this is actually a picture of me working as a fisheries observer aboard Bering Sea crab fishing boats, because I no longer have the gnarly beard or the fishing gear or anything. But that experience showed me firsthand that fisheries observers, VMS data sets, RFMO data sets all produce really vital, unique information. So our belief is just that since any data set has its own pros and cons in terms of data coverage, data access in some cases, data reporting timelines, we just think that the clearest view comes from stacking up all available information, using all the available tools in the tool belt in a complementary way. So that's how we hope this portal can fit into kind of existing techniques and approaches. Here are just a few ways that folks have used this carrier vessel portal so far. Before, in a couple minutes, I'll dive into the specifics of how the portal works and then end with just a quick 2-minute run through of a live demo of the tool so you can see some of the features. So the carrier vessel portal contains all detected potential transshipment activities for carrier vessels in one place. So this is a really nice feature because it can be challenging in some fisheries to quickly pull up historical info, especially if the carrier is coming from a different ocean basin or a different RFMO convention area. So this tool lets you enter the vessel name and then quickly pull up everything that we could see from that vessel going back years, including where it may have visited port, where there's potential transshipment activity. So you can just kind of get that immediately. And then, as I touched on in the last slide, this whole process of kind of cross-verifying different data sets, there's countries who've been using the carrier vessel portal to cross-reference this data with the other data sets that they have in hand, such as VMS data or reported transshipment records, in order really to validate some of those records and to see if any interesting discrepancies arise that they may want to look into further. We're actually currently doing this with Panama, where we're cross-referencing the data that we have in the portal with the data they have access to go through that process of seeing if any new views are produced by combining them, and using the opportunity to validate that and see if there's any discrepancies across data sets. Ultimately, we think that all this kind of effort helps boost transparency rather of where transshipment activity is occurring in an effort to support management of it. So how does it work? The carrier vessel portal, in addition to a lot of the other analyses that Global Fishing Watch does, relies on the automatic identification system, or AIS data. So this is a system that was originally developed for collision avoidance, so that vessels could see each other and not collide. And more recently, many satellites have been launched to detect this information, and then we build these machine learning algorithms on top of those big data sets so that we can tease out the information that we'd like to access. In this case, we run algorithms to detect where vessels may be meeting up at sea, indicating potential transshipment activity. So using that AIS data, we map vessel tracks all around the world and essentially flag when those tracks come close together for a certain amount of time at a low enough speed. In addition to that AIS data, we also have relied on vessel registry data, which was used to identify the authorization status of carrier vessels and fishing vessels in the portal. So we will ingest the various authorization records that are publicly available and display that back on that map. Here's one view of that tool. This is the interface you see when you first log in. And so you can see that potential transshipment data is separated out by RFMO in these different bars. And there's lots of other filters that I'll show in a minute. So you can filter out by like a particular EZ or a particular carrier flag state, all kinds of different fields like that. One really important caveat to keep in mind when you're looking at any of that authorization info is that we use publicly available authorization data. So if something appears out of date or incorrect, we can follow up on those registries or comment to see if there's any errors or if more updated info is available. In the top left of that screen, you can see there's two tabs for encounters and for loitering. These are the two kinds of events that comprise what I've been referring to as potential transshipments. So an encounter, that first kind of event, is where there's two vessels that come together on AIS. We could see both of those vessels, and we know that these transshipment capable vessels are together for at least 2 hours. So in that time, they could have potentially transshipped some catch, or of course, they could have also done a number of different activities such as transferring crew or supplies. So that's why we'll always say potential transshipment rather than a known transshipment event, because we're just flagging what we can see remotely. The second kind of event that we display is called a loitering event. And so this is when a carrier vessel loiters at a low speed, which could indicate a transshipment with a vessel that didn't have AIS on. So it's where we see just one of those vessels. One other important caveat to mention here, which I'm sure you all will be kind of familiar with in this field, is that there's always a few possibilities for what the vessel may have been doing. So this tool is definitely not meant for immediately finding IUU in isolation from other data sets, because in any case where you're interested in potentially unauthorized activity, it's really important to cross-verify other sources and make sure that you have a full picture. So this is diving a bit more into the specifics, where it shows that using the carrier vessel portal, you can actually pull up individual carrier vessel tracks and then scroll through on the left to see what events that carrier vessel may have been involved in, ranging from potential encounters, where here we zoom in and you can see two vessels meeting up. You could look at exactly which vessels it met up with. Or you can also look at loitering events, which is when that carrier vessel is stationary for a certain amount of time, which may or may not be of interest to certain contexts. One last field of data before I jump into the live demo is that I mentioned it also shows ports. So as you scroll through that carrier vessel's track, you can look at all the ports that we see that vessel enter when it has AIS on, and then kind of build that narrative if, say, the vessel's entering your port, for where it may have been and who it may have met up with. With that, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then I will very quickly switch to a live tab just to walk you through some of that processes of how you could use this tool. All right, you should be looking at the portal now, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Tim.
Great, thanks. So when you come here for the first time, you'll be prompted to log in, and you could just create a free login. You enter your email, then you get immediate access to the tool. And you'll see an interface kind of like this, where I mentioned here's encounters. And if you click loiterings up on this tab, it'll think for 10 seconds, and then it'll show you the loitering data. So there now you can see where those carrier vessels have been loitering throughout the world. We can switch back to encounters, and then I'll just quickly run through some ways that you can filter the data sets to your region or RFMO of interest, for instance. So currently all these bar plots show different encounters by RFMO, but you can also click this tab and find that same data grouped by EEZ, where we see many encounters in Russia's EEZ. Or say you can look at what's the flag state of the carrier vessel for the encounters that we detect on AIS. If there's ever a term that you're unfamiliar with, just put your cursor over that to gain a little bit more info. In particular, authorization status is a little bit nuanced. So we can see the colors that are displayed here. I'll just zoom on in. The colors that are displayed reflect that authorization status, where yellow is an event where we know that both of those vessels are on all the possible RFMO registration lists. Orange is kind of nuanced here. This is where there's multiple RFMO jurisdictions overlapping. So we know the vessel is on at least one of those RFMO jurisdiction or one of those RFMO lists, but it's not necessarily on all of them. For instance, which could be totally legal and not surprising at all. It usually is, in fact. So for instance, a vessel is authorized to WCPFC, but it's not authorized to MPFC because it's not fishing for that fishery. Don't look at orange and think orange equals bad. It's more just to reflect which registries the vessel is actually on the list of. And finally, red is a case where we cannot immediately or cannot find public information on its authorization status through any of our available means. One quick example, just to hopefully make that a little bit less abstract, we can click on this one encounter near Hawaii and then see that the event happened between a carrier vessel that was authorized to WCPFC and a donor vessel that was authorized to WCPFC as well. And then if we need more info, we can click more info and see that vessel's track. And we could also scroll through its history over time to pull up different events to see where that vessel may have been fishing, where that vessel may have been having encounters, that kind of thing. One very last detail here is that you can also toggle different layers if different layers are of interest to you. For instance, like you can turn on different RFMO layers, you can turn on or off ports, for instance. And then if you have a map that you are happy with, you can also click this button and take a screenshot of it for use either in your reports or for your notes or anything like that. With that, I am excited to hear of some case studies that the Pew Charitable Trusts have been using to try to kind of apply some of this data, and I will turn it over to Pew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for showing us the Carrier Vessel Portal, a free public available tool set. Our next speaker is Ms. Allison Kaufman. She works on Pew's International Fisheries team, focusing on ending illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Since joining the campaign, she has worked on reforming transshipment and improving fisheries enforcement through the analysis of automatic identification systems data. She also leads Pew's work on the Global Fishing Watch, with Global Fishing Watch, on developing a portal to visualize and analyze carrier vessel activity in the 5 global tuna regional fisheries management organizations. Allison, the virtual floor is yours.
So since we've heard, what the portal is, how it came to be, and what it does, I wanted to go through some case studies of how the portal could be used by management or security practitioners to kind of improve their efforts. So in this first example, let's say that we're interested in the South China Sea. So we can go ahead and zoom in to the South China Sea, and we can see here that there's really only 4 encounters that we have data for. And from a management perspective, we've got 2 that are red, which, as Tim mentioned, mean that there is no data. We don't have data, or we can't conclusively state whether or not those vessels held authorization from the RFMO in which these encounters occurred. So you could go ahead and investigate these further and get more info if that's what you're interested in. But there is a lot more activity that's happening in the South China Sea, and it's actually happening in the Loitering tab, which I actually have pulled up on this in this window, since it does take a couple seconds to load. And so as you can see, there is a lot more going on with loitering events, where, like Tim said, we really only have data for the one vessel, for the carrier vessel. So from a management side, if you're interested in finding out, what more you can do with these loitering events and why they might be useful, we do just have the data for the carrier vessel. Maybe it doesn't seem like it's something that you'd be interested in using, and I can show you really quickly how we've been able to match these loitering events to reported transshipment encounters. And so this is actually this one. So the 5 global tuna RFMOs don't really have consistency in terms of what they're asking observers on board to share in their observer reports. But one RFMO in particular, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, or ICAT, which manages the Atlantic Ocean tuna fisheries, does require that observers provide geolocations and timestamps for all transshipments that are observed at sea. And with that information, we've been able to actually validate or match these transshipments to not only encounters that we see via AIS, but also loitering events. And this is just one example. This Tycee Maroon number 15 vessel, we were able to match not only these encounters, but some of these loitering events to the reported transshipments that came out of observer reports. So with that in mind, as a management practitioner, you could go through some of these events, investigate them further, and see if anything looks like it could be related to transshipment, and then dig through your toolbox and see what other complementary information you have to kind of help pull that thread a little bit. I also know that we have some folks listening in who are not necessarily like super engaged in the fishing world, and so this portal can still be useful for security purposes, for non-fisheries related activity. And my background is in oceanography, so one of the things that I find really useful as a complementary tool to this software, or to this portal, is this oceanographic platform called Earth Wind Map. And there's a lot of different things that you can view here. And if you're looking for activity to kind of look through that isn't necessarily related to fishing, you could access an open source data set like this. I'm happy to share it with anybody who's interested, and try to figure out where fish might not be and look at the activity in that area, and that might be helpful. So one of the ways that this is useful to figure out where fish are, and this is very, very, very high level and very generic, but basically fish in a general sense enjoy or are found in areas where there's a lot of currents, a lot of sea surface currents, and a lot of strong ocean fronts, areas where temperatures are changing from kind of warm to less warm or to cool. And you can see that in these changing colors. So this data set we have up is showing sea surface currents over sea surface temperatures. So in these areas kind of bordering land, we see a lot of currents and we see changes in temperature. So carriers that are hanging out around these kind of swirling currents or converging currents and temperature changes are more likely, but not specifically, but more likely to be related to activity that might be engaging with fishing vessels that are, transferring fish. So in these areas where there's not a lot going on, you might want to look at some of the activity there if you're interested in parsing through these loitering events to see some vessels that might be engaged in things other than the transfer of fish. So like if we just look at this vessel here, or this loitering event here, and if we were to click on more info, because this loitering event is kind of happening outside of these areas where fish might be, we can see that this vessel isn't doing a whole lot of encounter, isn't really engaging with other fishing vessels at sea. It's largely transiting between a couple of Asian ports. And so as this, if you're interested in data that's not specific to fisheries, you could look at the loitering data to figure out what these vessels are doing that's not specifically related to fishing activity. So that's just like kind of one example of how you can parse through this data set and pull out instances that might be related to other things. Another thing that you could use or that this is useful for is, whether it's from a management perspective or from an enforcement perspective, is if you're looking at vessel authorizations and getting into that more nuanced discussion of authorizations like Tim was talking about. So there's this vessel that we investigated for a report we were writing for one of the tuna RFMOs, the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna, which not surprisingly manages Southern Bluefin Tuna. This RFMO is unique in that they have no geographic bounding. They don't focus on any other species other than this one species, Southern Bluefin Tuna. And so in order to capture, transship, land Southern Bluefin Tuna, the vessels need to have prior authorization from the RFMO to do any of those things. So we were interested in looking for vessels that did not comply with CCSBT management measures or regulations. And we found this vessel, Ping Tai Rong Lang, which, as you can see under the authorizations, CCSBT is not listed here. So it was not authorized to transship Southern Bluefin Tuna at the time that we were looking at these kind of encounters. A lot of these encounters that we're looking at, you can see are orange because, oh no. Let's see if we can refresh this. Because these fishing vessels hold authorization from another RFMO, but not from CCSBT. And that's concerning for CCSBT because the fishing activity that these fishing vessels were conducting prior to these encounters were in Southern Bluefin Tuna hotspots during peak Southern Bluefin Tuna fishing seasons. So the likelihood of Southern Bluefin Tuna being caught by these fishing vessels and then transshipped by Ping Tai Rong Lang 2 was heightened. And so it was cause for concern. And we weren't the only ones that thought so. CCSBT actually put out a notice about this vessel's activities as a potential non-member fishing activity notification. So there are a couple of different, these are just a couple of different ways that you can kind of like use this portal. And again, just kind of reiterating what Tim had mentioned at the beginning, this is not one quick way to identify instances of illegality. This is one tool for your toolbox, and that can complement everything else that you've got, and can hopefully start to complement some more open source platforms as well. And with that, I will toss back over to Keith.
Ian, you mentioned using alternative methods to engage the younger generation. What other platforms are being explored, such as gaming platforms?
Yeah, so I mean, we are presently in conversation with a large gaming company. Obviously, I want to walk that path a bit carefully because I don't want to glamorize violence or sort of bastardize the reporting. But there are some really good companies out there that take what's called non-scripted content, documentary type material, and build educational games, but that aren't boring, and one company in particular we've been talking with for a year now is moving ahead with possibly taking the reported content in the book and trying to build an educational game that would increase people's fluency about the range of crimes out there without turning violence or crime into play. But I do think, the gaming realm is a really interesting realm, not just in the sense of the huge audience that globally is involved with it, but also epistemologically, the way that gaming creators take information and design them interactively, I find really exciting. Podcast is also another tool in the kit that we have a Nat Geo grant, and we're building a podcast presently with Nat Geo around the Outlaw Ocean reporting, and quite especially the Outlaw Ocean music project that takes a look at sort of ocean issues, but as rendered through different musicians in different places and different styles who are grappling with these issues and trying to do something about it. So podcast is another thing. And then, a third example is I'm a big fan of hip hop and rap and have been since I was young, and was very enamored with Lin-Manuel Miranda and what he did with Hamilton. So I teamed up with a really talented rapper who wrote a 7-track rap album based on the book. And then he and I recruited a bunch of former Hamilton Broadway stars to rap that album. And then we reached out to animators and stop motion artists of differing styles from around the world to make videos that correspond with each song. And the 7-track album will essentially be revealed later this year with the Hamilton folks as a sort of mini documentary that's an alternate way to experience the stories in the book. So these are just some sort of different odd experiments that we're engaged in.
Great, thanks, Ian. So who's your favorite rap artist?
Well, this is going to date me. I like Lupe Fiasco. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Lupe Fiasco, so we'll go with him.
All right, thank you. So Ian, this is gonna be a multi-part question. I'll start with you, and then the latter half we'll have Tim and Allison comment. But do you find flag state jurisdiction for enforcement for illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing breaches or lack of enforcement problematic still?
Yeah, I mean, the true experts on the call are the other panelists to get into the weeds of this. But my kind of expertise in reporting these issues, the most acute engagement with the problems of flags of convenience in particular, and the nature and the ease with which various players in the maritime space can evade either supply chain transparency, can evade law enforcement by simply turning over their flag and renaming their vessel. That vexing challenge was most acutely one that emerged with a whole series of reporting we did in a chapter called the Somali 7 about a bunch of Thai ships that were fishing near Somalia. And that case is still ongoing. Those 7 vessels that had captive Cambodian crews, 120 of them, just routinely they shifted from Thai flag to Somali flag to Eritrean flag to Iranian flag, and sort of at every step over the past 4 years when we've been chasing them, they simply roll over. And it's not just we, it's the Thai government and Interpol and a bunch of folks that we work with, TMT. So I do still find that is a really big problem, and the sort of structural incentive for bad actors to look for those flag registries that have the least oversight and rules on them is something that I think the maritime community will have to confront soon.
Thanks, Ian. And then now to Allison and then to Tim, but building on Ian's response and then also answering, how do you see or how do you plan to use Ian's research that he's done through all of his efforts to achieve regulatory policy reforms and strengthen the rule of law at sea? Allison.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian summed it up really well. Management of fisheries at sea is already a very complex and difficult process. There's lack of transparency, there's lack of information sharing. All of this activity happens far from the reach and watchful eye of enforcement officials. And complicating that further is this ability for bad actors to be able to switch their flag whenever they feel like it, and that is really, really complicated. And in terms of being able to utilize data to improve that practice or kind of combat it, Pew does have within our campaign, we have somebody working on flag state work and improving the role of flag states and their relationships with their fleets. And so I'm not the expert on that, so I won't pretend to know more about that. But Pew does have a lot of work engaging with flag states, and I'm sure that there's plenty of blogs and articles on our website that could be found that could speak to that. But I also imagine from a data perspective, it's kind of a nightmare, and I'm sure Tim can talk to that more.
Thanks, Allison. Tim, any final comments before moving on to our next question?
I think that's been summed up very nicely so far. And I'll just say that I'm also very excited for the role that technology has to play in continuing to make progress against IUU, as we've seen in the last few years. Countries taking real steps to apply that to really cut down on that issue. For instance, I think the world we live in 10 years from now, technologically, in terms of what we can see in the ocean, will be pretty unrecognizable when I consider things like that the world's largest satellite constellation in existence right now is not maintained by the US government or Russia. It's a private company that started making satellites in a garage in Cupertino, and now can image the whole world every day. And that's happened just over the last several years. So I think that technology's ability to detect events at sea is going to bring transparency that maybe was hard to imagine 10 years ago, and will make real impacts against the fight on IUU.
Thanks, Tim. So kind of building on that technology theme, can you comment on combining other data sets with the carrier vessel portal directed towards other illegality beyond IUU fishing?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I should have mentioned during that demo is that there's also a download tab in the upper right-hand corner of that screen. So if folks prefer to work outside of the carrier vessel portal themselves and they just want to use it kind of as a data download, you can directly take that data and bring it into whatever system you prefer. So we make it available for combination with VMS systems, with, say, intelligence reports. So I strongly agree with that premise that any of these data sets are best used in combination with others. So we want to make it as easy as possible for folks to kind of take advantage of the tools they've been using, plus some of the latest advances from big data and machine learning.
Thanks, Tim. Could you also comment just on technology by criminals to counter monitoring efforts that have been effective, such as GPS spoofing, or I know you said in the carrier vessel portal you're relying on AIS data, but what can be done for vessels that lack AIS?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of specific kind of limitations to AIS data, Keith just touched on spoofing, which is where vessels can manipulate the position that their AIS device indicates. So we've countered that by this kind of, folks have tried to spoof, and then we've built algorithms to detect that quite effectively, because it turns out the AIS signals that we get, that includes information on where specifically that satellite is located. So we could see if it's possible for a vessel to be where it says it is based on the actual footprint of that satellite. So I think some of this kind of cracking old nuts takes the application of new technology and some of these newer analytical techniques that we can now make great use of. And then while recognizing that AIS gives us a really important subset of vessels, we think it shows about 50 to 75% of fishing activity on the high seas based on a paper that we published in Science a few years ago where we kind of demonstrated these techniques. However, it's never going to really detect everything. So increasingly, Global Fishing Watch has been working with countries that wish to share their VMS data so that they can combine this AIS insight with their VMS insight. So thousands of vessels, the VMS data for thousands of vessels is now publicly accessible. Nations including Panama, Indonesia, Peru, Chile, like major fishing nations have moved that direction so far. And outside of AIS or VMS, we're also taking advantage of really the most cutting edge advances in optical imagery, including the example that Ian Urbina touched on, where optical imagery is getting really good at finding vessels at sea now. So we are increasingly branching out to these different technologies to, again, go with that approach of combining insights everywhere you can get it.
Thanks, Tim. Ian, over to you. So I know you commented on how you've been working with academia, nonprofits, NGOs with all your research activity and whatnot. But how are you partnering or working with government agencies to build towards some sort of enforcement type mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So at the end of the day, I don't want to lose my membership card as a journalistic practitioner, right? So I have to be a bit careful about crossing the line into advocacy on the one side with NGOs and other types, or crossing the line and becoming sort of an agent of law enforcement on the other side with governments. It's not that hard to stay away from those fences, but it is really important, in my view, to do so, so that I can maintain my status of as a journalist. So what I do is, and what I do that's different than what I did when I was on staff at the New York Times is, at the New York Times, I couldn't testify before Congress. At the New York Times, I was not allowed to. At the New York Times, I was not allowed to have closed-door meetings with law enforcement or government officials or any types of sources about a story before the story ran. I could take in information from them, but I couldn't provide them information. There were just these certain rules that were, are fairly typical to, Washington Post, New York Times, these sorts of places. At the Outlaw Ocean Project, I'm my own boss and I set my own rules, and I have a different view on some of those. So I testify before Congress. I don't advocate specific policies, but I do try to provide the insight that the journalism is providing to decision makers and stakeholders in a neutral way that will empower them. So I do that. I do have a regular policy of sitting down before, during, and after stories with key stakeholders, be they corporate, be they government, law enforcement, Interpol, NGOs, and talk with them about what I'm doing in a very transparent way. And I very much think it helps my journalism, but it also helps the point of my journalism, which is public service, sort of investigative. It's meant to drive change. And so I want to equip these players with what I'm finding in an unvarnished, safe way. And it also just builds relationships with these folks if they know that I'm willing to come with it to them and say, hey, look, in 2 months, I'm going to put out a story and here's roughly what it's going to say. If you want to tell me something in a safe fashion that I should know before I do that, now is your chance. But let's have an off-record conversation. So these sorts of things, and so I do have really good relations with several governments. There was mention of Minister Susi. She's out of office now, but had really strong relations in Indonesia and Thailand, in Somalia, even Argentina, Chile, just regular correspondence, Ecuador with the Galapagos fleet. So I do have sort of steady debriefings with them about the reporting I'm doing, and it's helped the journalism.
I think you're muted.
Keith, you're muted.
Sorry about that. The good old mute button. Allison, I think this one might be for you, but are maritime crimes, particularly IUU fishing, connected to great power competition? If so, how can we, being the US government, do a better job to encourage other nation states to comply with international law and dissuade the People's Republic of China from their IUU efforts in those nation waters? And I'll add not just PRC, but if we're talking any of the top 5 distant water fishing fleets that there are in the world.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I don't know that I would classify it specifically as a great power competition issue necessarily, but it is a good reason for countries to continue to work together and increase their information sharing and levels of transparency, hopefully increasing the chances of capturing and prosecuting bad actors. So I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but hopefully.
Keith, I would jump in here because I've been
Absolutely.
doing a lot of reporting on the Chinese fleet globally, and I'm also a little bit less constrained than I think maybe other institutional on the China issue. So I would argue that there is a great power conflict unfolding at sea, and it does quite involve China, which is not to set China up as any different than the US was not that long ago. These are imperial powers that are seeking to grow, and not always for nefarious reasons. China has a huge population to feed and wants to expand. But the China presence at sea is really interesting in lots of ways. One, their use of subsidies to sort of grow their fleet is distinct and robust, and contributes to an overcapacity of boats on the water. Their use of the fishing fleet to actually engage in other sorts of geopolitical plays. So you look at the Spratlys, for example, you look at the South China Sea, a lot of those fishing boats are only ostensibly fishing boats, meaning they're there in large numbers to establish facts on the ground, to establish historical precedent that they're there, and to, in some ways, flex muscle in the region vis-a-vis the Vietnamese and the Philippines and the Indonesians and others and the US. And by having lots of boats there, even if they don't have nets or hooks in the water, they are showing that they have a track record of being in the region. So when they start building islands, and the arguments come up in, international bodies, WTO, they can point to this long and robust presence in certain regions. And so I do think that is a geopolitical matter, and it has to do with the Chinese desire, again, not distinct from what the US has been doing for a long time, is an effort to establish a presence for the sake of fishing ground rights, for commercial throughway, such as oil, for drilling rights. These are all key motivations for the fishing fleet in China to be going places and establishing their presence.
Thanks, Ian. And this next question is going to be for you too, just because you may have seen it firsthand with your reporting and all your travels. But what have you seen with the gender gap? Does it remain? Is it improving at all when it's coming to fishing community, or just different impacts to human smuggling and those things that you've witnessed. Oh, mute, Ian.
The gender gap in the maritime space, meaning within the workforce, or help me understand that question a little bit more. Sorry.
Yes, from the workforce.
I mean, the maritime space, be it merchant marine or fishing, is insanely, masculine. I spent 7 years on these vessels. Every month or two, I'm at sea, and the only place where I see anything near 50-60% kind of proportionality in gender is Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd, these sorts of ships. You find women on these vessels a little bit more in merchant marine. Certainly, obviously, navies and Coast Guard, especially the U.S., different matter entirely. But in the merchant marine, in the commercial sector, you do find some presence of women, 5-10% max. The ITF, the Global Transport Union, has done a lot of really good work on this issue. In the fishing domain, especially distant water fishing, but even near shore, you do not find women on these vessels, especially as you get out of more into the global south. Now, that is not to say there are really interesting and complicated places where women really dominate that sector. So I was just offshore near Gambia, and in Gambia, the local fish markets are all run by women, and the ones who are hurting the most because of the big industrial boats feeding the big industrial factories, those fish are not ending up in the local markets. The fishmongers are hurting the most, and that has downstream repercussions for the family structure, et cetera. But on boats and on the water itself, this is really still a highly, highly male scene.
Thanks, Ian. And some of our audience actually just commented that only 2% of female seafarers are female. So definitely appreciate that interaction from our audience as well. Tim, kind of going back to the carrier vessel portal, how do you see the reliability of it? Since AIS and VMS are not compulsory for all fishing vessels, does Global Fishing Watch have any specific study regarding AIS manipulation or other kind of studies related to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Keith. We actually currently are working on a study on AIS disabling. So it turns out based on what we can say about how the constellation of AIS satellites is oriented and what satellite coverage looks like in a given spot in the ocean, we can parse out gaps in AIS data that may be due to just bad coverage from the gaps in the data that appear to be intentional in their nature. So we're going to be working to publish that data set and that method so that we can kind of add just another layer of information on how you might interpret AIS data. And of course, a intentional AIS disabling event is not necessarily illegal because the legality of AIS usage varies by country, varies by jurisdiction, based on whether or not you're in a domestic voyage or an international voyage. There's a lot of factors, but knowing when AIS is intentionally disabled has been found by some of our partners to be a useful management tool. So the first part of the question, yes, working on it, hope to submit that paper soon. Am I not getting to the second part of that question? What was that again?
You answered it, Tim, because it was really just referring to the reliability of the carrier vessel portal and then any studies in regards to AIS manipulation that's going on that could be impacting that reliability to the portal.
Cheers. Yeah. The other thing we point to with regards to reliability is just the scientific papers that we've published that demonstrate these techniques. So we have all of our code for analysis be totally open source and publicly available. Our data is publicly available, so there can be lots of eyes on it to speak to issues where there's issues with the data and improve it, or to apply the existing data.
Thanks, Tim. Ian, back to you. Did your stories involve or get sponsored by any coastal state governments?
No, I mean, that gets back to my point about maintaining journalistic integrity and autonomy. I can't be taking money from governments or corporations. We do take, it's a nonprofit, and we're funded by philanthropic organizations, but always with a very high editorial wall, much like ProPublica and a bunch of other nonprofit news outlets have now. We have the same standard. So any money that is either individual donors, subscribers, or philanthropies comes in with no control over what stories we cover or how we cover them. And that's a prerequisite to being able to do independent journalism. But we haven't taken money from governments of any sort for, I think, those reasons. But we do work with governments in lots of other ways. So in-kind access is essential. So, just got back from a embed offshore. Often these are with Coast Guards, and we get lots of help from governments so as to get certain places or to get access onto certain ships so as to tell these stories. And obviously, people help if they see self-interest, right? So we get access to these things usually from governments that are eager to see what they think that story will say. We don't ever tell them in advance exactly what the story will say because we can't do that. But we do get a lot of help in that way from law enforcement, but not funds.
Thanks, Ian. Interesting just how those different partnerships and networks really blend together and play out over time. Allison, I think this one may be for you, but can you comment on engagement with Pacific Rim, Central and South American governments that maybe the Pew Charitable Trust has?
Yeah, so we work with countries on signing on to treaties that we advocate for, such as the Cape Town Agreement or the Port State Measures Agreement. And we've also partnered with the US Navy and Coast Guard to engage them in multinational maritime security exercises in the Pacific, such as CCAT. So there are a number of ways that Pew is kind of working in this space.
Thanks, Allison. Ian, what actually piqued your interest in starting this Outlaw Ocean project?
Well, so the original reporting that began in 2014 ran for 2 years in the New York Times, right, as a series. And what motivated me to turn toward the Outlaw Ocean series was a combination of factors. As an investigative journalist, I'm supposed to find virgin snow, topically, and find topics that are fresh and consequential, things that are broken that need to be fixed. And I largely work on human rights, labor abuses, and to some degree, environmental concerns. And I had worked previously, before joining the Times, as an anthropologist and taken some time off and worked on a ship running away from my dissertation. And that had kind of confronted me with this weird diaspora, transient tribe of people called seafarers. And I was just riveted by them and always wanted to get back to that space and those people and sort of chronicle their world. That's what motivated the original series. Then I got hooked, I got hooked on the place that is the ocean. I got hooked on the people that are seafarers and just how voiceless they are as a demographic. I also got hooked on the fact that there was so little journalism of this sort coming out of that space. There were routinely one-off stories, often quite good, but they were one-offs, and they were often built on academic studies or advocacy papers, and to my eye, were not really effective at driving change. And there was very few narrative, long-form investigative journalism happening with reporting out there. And when I got out there, I thought, wow, there are so many stories that aren't being told. So from that perspective, I got really hooked journalistically on that space. And that's why I decided to step away from the Times and create my own organization.
Thanks, Ian. Interesting just to see how it all, hear how it's all come together for you. Tim and Allison, I think this might be next, but what are the challenges of working with the RFMOs? And are you working with all of them, some of them? Just can you expand upon that work that Global Fishing Watch and Pew Charitable Trust have done in the development of the carrier vessel portal?
I can go ahead and answer first. So Pew has a very long history of working with RFMOs, and there are challenges. It's an interesting space because you have a lot of different members who want different things to be improved or changed, and so everybody's fighting for kind of a say in how things are run. At the same time, you have these dwindling stocks that are decreasing because of things like global warming, because of overfishing, unreported fishing, while also trying to kind of like increase their catches for economic purposes, to help improve food security, all these different issues. So it is a very complex space. Pew engages with RFMOs as observers. So, we don't have a say in how anything is run, which is appropriate because we're not countries. We're just an organization. But, we engage with them not just from the perspective of ending illegal fishing or transshipment, but we also engage with them in terms of setting catch quotas and, trying to make sure that more science is engaged in setting those quotas or in different management decisions. So I think there's a lot that we do with RFMOs, and we really want to help kind of improve the conscious and science-based decision-making process at the RFMOs. And through the use of tools like the Carrier Vessel Portal, we've been able to analyze data and bring those findings to the RFMOs to help kind of move the needle, so to speak, for some of these different campaign goals.
Thanks. And then I'll jump in there to say that at Global Fishing Watch, we're a really new organization. We've been an independent organization for just a few years now. And a lot of those since 2017, and those first couple of years were pretty much spent, with our head down, a bunch of fisheries people and computer folks figuring out what we could say with the data reliably. And then we were waiting to get it peer reviewed and published before we really started to run with it. So now we're entering this kind of exciting stage where we get to try to begin those engagements and see where we can be helpful. And so our RFMO engagement is quite new. We've been submitting some of the reports that Allison touched on, where we compare Global Fishing Watch data sets with some of the things that we can see through public RFMO data. And just generally availing ourselves and our data sets in case they could be useful for really any of their activities. We kind of see ourselves as like the neutral, data-focused Switzerland of the fisheries data world, where we don't hold a broad advocacy range of views. We really just try to make our data available for folks however they can use it for their priorities. Really, our one advocacy push is to combine data and make use of the available data when possible. So it's been exciting to see some examples where that's happened so far, and we are very happy to offer that data and services to anyone who could use it.
Thanks, Tim. So we have, in about our last 5 to 10 minutes that we have left, time for a couple more questions. And I'll need some help on this one, as I think to who may want to answer it first. But how is climate change impacting global fishing?
I'll go.
Thanks, Ian.
How's it impacting? It's adding pressure to small island nations because sea level rise is disappearing those nations. It's also adding to geopolitical strife in the sense that by disappearing, nations' boundaries are often, their sea boundaries are often set by an atoll here and a rock over there, and sort of claims to the map as being established by pieces of land that create the outer perimeter, right? But as that outer perimeter and the rocks or atolls go underwater, contestation rises, because now the line between this country and that country is up for debate because that atoll is no longer there. So you do have sea level rise really sowing a sense of worry I'm speaking here specifically about reporting we did in Palau and one of its outermost islands that really kind of establish a big chunk of its sea border is going to go underwater soon, and what the repercussions will be for that in terms of their loss of sea space and the fishing rights. So this is just one example. Obviously, climate change is having a key role in the coral bleaching events and, you know, sort of acidification concerns. It's having a huge role. And again, I shouldn't be talking about this stuff because there are fishery experts on the phone, but, you know, there are major roles to the affecting the food pyramid, you know, at sea. And you see this strange and disruptive presence with squid and with jellyfish and sea blooms, all sort of being thrown out of whack, and migratory patterns adjusting. All of these disruptive factors affect human lives that have for decades, if not centuries, depended on certain patterns that are now being thrown to the wind. So those are just some examples.
Thanks, Ian. So I have one last question that I think we'll sum everything up with, and we're going to answer it. I'll give each of you an opportunity to answer it, but we're going to start reverse order. So it'll be Allison, Tim, then Ian. But what's your recommendation of why someone from the general public or even a government official that doesn't look at fish or isn't a security practitioner pay attention and take action on this problem set? Allison.
Because it's cool. Like, way to be nerdy if you don't care about fish. No, I think, you know, I came into this not really caring about fish. And, you know, like I said, my background is in oceanography, and I started learning more and more about the fishing industry to try to kind of find a connection between the work that I was doing and the human side of you know, how my work kind of impacted people's lives. And probably through the reporting of folks like Ian, I was able to learn a lot more about just how complicated this industry is and how cultural it is. And so it's not just something that happens at sea and then somehow ends up on our plates at the dinner table. This is a historical and cultural practice, and it's something that has huge economic ramifications. And so to not really try to consider, you know, more about the food that's on your plate and like how it got there and why we eat it, I think I just think that there's so much more to that story. And I really applaud folks like Ian and also the folks at Global Fishing Watch for helping to make information more accessible to the general public and tell this story in a way that isn't just like some NGO coming in with policy wonky information. But it is very important.
Thanks, Allison. Tim, over to you.
For me, I kind of always grew up fishing. Fishing's been in my family, and most of my earliest memories are at the beach with my dad fishing. So it's been something I knew I always wanted to be involved in as a career. And those interests kind of shifted from, oh man, this is fun catching a halibut, to kind of scientific study of tagging large sharks and fish to figure out how to better conserve them, to now using some of those same techniques, analytical techniques at least, applying them to fisheries. So I think even if you, for some reason, aren't interested in fish themselves, there's no question into the way that they feed so many people's bodies, they feed so many economies, and are such a vital part of all of our planet going forward. So I'm really thrilled to be able to play whatever role I can in supporting sustainable fisheries. I consider myself very pro-fisheries in that regard, and I'm just thrilled to be able to help.
Thank you, Tim. And Ian, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to, I think Allison and Tim really summed it up, and they're kind of the true frontline soldiers on this. I think I would go back to the original point I made about all of us thinking about this space as the sort of producer, you know, reminding ourselves that the oceans produce 50% of the air we breathe, and that 56 million people work out there, and that huge amounts of protein come to us by way of the sea, and so much commerce traverses it. Like, that mantra, I think, is important to keep us broadening our lens and also thinking not just about fish, but about fishers, commerce, all the activities that happen out there. And then I would say, okay, if you're an average person, you're a taxpayer, you're a consumer, you're a donor, you're a parent, you're a partner, you're all these different things that doesn't live in isolation and that is complicit in what happens to the people and the marine life out there. And so whether it's dumping or illegal fishing or murder or sea slavery, all of these things are happening in a space, and it's not that difficult to trace them back to you as a consumer far away. And I think if you can just keep that in mind, then it just gets to you at an ethical level, that at a practical level, if we lose the health of this space, and if we turn away from the human rights and labor concerns occurring in this space, we're really complicit in the sort of harm done. And so for that reason, I think everyone should be interested.
But I'd like to thank our guest speakers for a very informative session on understanding transshipment and crime. Thank you for educating our audience on finding creative ways to reach new audiences while educating and connecting with the next generation. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. To our audience joining us from all over, thank you for your participation today. If you have any questions or ideas for future engagements, please contact APCSS at this email address. We also ask that you please complete our end of webinar survey posted in the chat. Mahalo and aloha.